Well, the Honorable James Shaw is New Zealand's Minister of Climate Change and Associate Minister for the Environment, and he's kind enough to join us on the show. Minister Shaw, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, we're so honored to have you on the show. You know, the day the IPCC report came out, we were lucky enough to talk to one of the authors of the report about the science behind it. But as you well know, this report is to brief policymakers like yourself, and you're actually the first policymaker that we've spoken to since the report came out. So I'm curious, when you were seeing the summary for policymakers that IPCC put out, what'd you make of it?
Well, somebody asked me if it came as a shock, and I guess my answer was no, because what it really did was to confirm that what was actually happening was roughly in line with what we knew was going to happen, you know, and putting to bed all of those myths that the computer models are all wrong and all that kind of stuff. Turns out that they were bang on in terms of, you know, global temperature increases. But it really was a wake-up call, because I think what it did was it sort of added a level of detail and vividness to, you know, this kind of unfolding catastrophe. And so I sort of took it as, well, you know, we've got to get the word out about this, because you know, it's just so clear that we're not only are we running out of time, we are out of time.
And I know, you know, when a report like this comes out, it's really important what policymakers take away from it, because that, you know, obviously that's what it's for, but it also matters how it's covered, you know, how the general public reacts to it. And I have to imagine, like you just mentioned, people are going to come up and talk to you about it in Parliament and Cabinet when anything huge that's climate related comes out of it. So when you're thinking about the broader general public and some of your fellow policymakers who are not in climate day to day, when they ask you what to make about something like this, what do you think it's crucial to get across to them?
Well, I think there's probably three things. First of all, that you know, it is confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that you know, the temperature is rising due to human activity. Second of all, that the effects of climate change are happening sooner, more frequently, and more severe than was predicted, and that therefore the kind of scale and the urgency with which we need to reduce emissions is kind of absolutely underlined, right? So that's kind of the summary of what I've been saying to my colleagues, and actually also what I've been saying when I've been talking to the media about it, because it did get a reasonable amount of media attention over here, and partially that's because the media themselves have gone through quite a journey on climate change over the last few years, and are now actually covering it, and covering it, you know, from a truthful stance. Not like there's two sides to this. They're saying, actually, there is only one story here, and here it is, and kind of vivid detail. It's funny. I mean, when I started running for Parliament in the late 2000s, and we couldn't get a story up on climate change to save ourselves, you know, for much of that time. In fact, the 2011, 2014 election campaigns that we had, the Green Party, we were like seriously debating about whether to campaign on climate change as one of our big platforms, because no one was interested. You know, we just couldn't get it out there. And that's just done an absolute backflip. And I mean, I can't even keep up with the media. Like if I open one of the apps for one of our main channels, you know, there'll be half a dozen stories that day on, you know, whether it's new electric vehicle models that are coming down the line, or what does it mean for flood risk in small towns, you know, located near rivers, to, you know, like, it's just this plethora of news. So I was pretty pleased that, you know, the kind of the main outlets that we have here did cover it, and covered it honestly.
Well, in 2017, you became New Zealand's 6th Minister of Climate Change. So what are your main responsibilities as Minister of Climate Change?
Look, the job changes depending on who's in it, but also where we are in the cycle. So my job is focused primarily on our domestic economy and on the need to start decoupling our economic development from our emissions growth. So we, have not yet successfully managed to do that. We've had significant population growth in the last 25 years, significant economic growth, and our emissions have just kept rising alongside. Well, actually, that's not strictly true. Our emissions have been broadly about the same level since about 2005, but they have not yet started to come down, and certainly not in any sustained fashion. So you get years that are lower than the year before and so on, but it's just been bouncing around at roughly the same level. And so my kind of primary focus really has been on putting in place a legislative and regulatory framework for actually driving emissions down in absolute terms. I do have some international responsibilities, and I'd like to devote more effort and attention to that, but the domestic program is so huge that I really kind of need to focus primarily on that. Previous ministers of climate change have focused almost entirely on the international framework.
Well, that's a ton of responsibility, and I'm sure your job is tough enough, but COVID disrupted everyone's way of life last year. And I imagine that it made your job even tougher as you were working on domestic policy to curb New Zealand's carbon emissions, as well as, like you said, working with other countries to address the climate crisis. So logistically, how difficult was it to legislate under those strict COVID protocols?
Well, fortunately, I had gotten through most of my legislative program by the time the COVID really started to have an impact on things like lockdowns. We also in New Zealand, we had a very short lockdown. It sort of lasted, like the kind of core lockdown was 4 weeks. It sort of ran out to about 7 for, because we sort of staged exit out of it. We had a couple of other shorter regional lockdowns later in the year, but we didn't have the kind of long, repeated cycles. So Parliament was able to sit kind of reasonably normally for much of the year, but we also had an election, and that did get disrupted. It got delayed by a month, and so on. And of course, the thing about election years is you can't really have a very heavy legislative agenda in an election year anyway, because Parliament doesn't sit for a reasonable amount of the time, and because of COVID, it kind of blew everything out of the water. But we had already gotten through the main reforms to our emissions trading scheme. We put in place this thing called the Zero Carbon Act, which sets the, high level goals, and so on. But my job now is to actually implement the Zero Carbon Act, to do what the law requires us to do. And that's the hard part.
Yeah, I want to talk about that Zero Carbon Act in just a little bit, but I'm curious, as you think about your job going forward, billions of people around the world to varying levels of success did understand the threat of COVID, at least initially, right? We understood, people could understand that this was an extreme threat, and that had to be communicated by governments, and then we had to react. I mean, the lockdowns in their early days, again, it was a bit of a mixed bag here in the United States compared to New Zealand, but people did stay at home in the initial days of COVID. And I'm thinking about, what did you learn from the way that COVID was communicated that can be applied to the climate crisis?
Well, let me preface that. So one of the things that I have said a number of times is that in evolutionary terms, humans are very well equipped to deal with a very clear and present danger, right? That tiger over there is going to eat me. I am going to take action to avoid that from happening. But we are extremely poorly equipped to deal with slow-moving, distributed, largely invisible threats like climate change. And so, it's really only, we've known the data for donkey's years, right, for most of my life. But it's not until we start having a lived experience of the consequences that we kind of go, I wonder if we should do something about this. course, the problem is by the time you're experiencing the consequences, it's a little bit too late to do much about it because things have already changed. That is the period in which we find ourselves now. And so I think we need to do a better job in our communications of connecting, events with climate change, right? So whether you're talking wildfires in California or Australia, or here, and we've had, 2 significant wildfires in the last few years, there's kind of permanent droughts that you're seeing in some parts of the world, storms that are changing in their nature and their severity and their frequency, flood events like we've had in Germany and Wuhan and, Turkey and, you name it, and here. And actually for a long time, scientists were very reluctant to pin or attribute any given event on climate change. And yet more recently that science has become much more sophisticated. And, for example, we've had these horrendous flood events in the last couple of months here in our winter. And it's not like we don't have flood events. We've always had flood events. It's that kind of country. But the severity of them and the nature of them is changing. And our scientists are now going, within days of the event, are able to say, yep, that event, it's not that it was caused by climate change, but it was exacerbated by climate change. And so I think we need to do a better job of actually letting people know that, the reason why they're having to evacuate their town is because, this is what climate change looks like. This is what it feels like.
And as we look forward to the rest of 2021 and the COP26 event coming up, and I just think international leadership overall, a lot of people are just looking at New Zealand thinking, New Zealand got so much right and did so well when it came to its COVID response. So take us back to those cabinet meetings in the early days. What is the Prime Minister doing and your cabinet doing to focus on making the pandemic response a success?
Well, I don't know if you remember some of those illustrations of the different curves that were going around. So there's this, for a while in the early days, sort of February, give or take, there was this idea that you would bend the curve, right? So from instead of having this really very, very steep but quite short cycle where it's swept through the population, caused colossal damage, but then you get kind of herd immunity. That was sort of like the worst option, because it would totally overwhelm the health system, and did overwhelm the health system and systems of many countries. The idea was that you could, through good measures, you could sort of suppress that. So it would happen over a longer time period, but the peak would come right down to a line in which your health system could cope. And I think what we realized as we were gearing up was that there was virtually no level at which we could have community transmission at which our health system would be able to cope with it. And so the kind of idea of, we talked about going hard and going early, this idea that, you actually kind of basically shut the country down before you get runaway community transmission rather than after you've got it, sort of became the only viable option. And it was backed up by, fortunately, in the business community, we had, at the kind of big end of town, people saying, look, if this gets away, the kind of the economic carnage is going to be, massive, and lots and lots and lots of thousands of people are going to lose their lives. So the business community was saying, actually, we'd rather take the short-term hit, keep everyone alive, and then we'll kind of deal with the economic mess afterwards, right? Because that's just, it's going to be bad either way, which is the least worst option here. And so, it was the difficulty was around needing to make sure that, there were no other options that were less worse than the full lockdown option. but the corollary was kind of needing to get people's compliance, right? You've got to have you say to your entire population, pretty much, other than your essential workers, hey, we need you to go and sit in your bedrooms for the next 4 to 7 weeks. You kind of need people to actually do that for it to work. And in the early days, we only had kind of a handful of cases. You'd sort of have 1 and then 2 and then 4. And yet, people were looking at that stage, Italy, which just had, and a few other countries, but Italy was kind of like the worst case at that time, in early March. And it wasn't until, we kind of hit double figures. I know that sounds tiny these days, right? But it's the beginning of the J curve that I think the population was significantly, worried, and able to relate what was going on here with what they could see had already happened in other countries. That cabinet could say, yeah, okay, now's the moment. But, and this is the extrapolation to climate change, the window was incredibly narrow because it had to come just late enough to be able to get that level of compliance. But if we'd left it 24 to 76 hours, we might have missed that window. And so it was a very, very tense time in mid-March, trying to just perfectly nail that moment. And I think, to relate it back to climate change, that sort of feels like on a longer time where we're at right now.
Yeah, and we are podcasting from a country whose leadership made a ton of mistakes, not only in the early days of the pandemic, but as the pandemic raged on. And I'm curious, I know you had to be monitoring how other world leaders acted, how other countries were acting on the pandemic. What did you spot other countries doing wrong?
Well, I think the circumstances of every country are obviously quite different, both politically and economically, but also in terms of the logistics of a lockdown. And so, for us, it was, I think it was just painfully clear from the experience that other countries were having where, community transmission had kind of gotten away, that we just simply couldn't allow that to happen here. It just, it looked horrendous from what we could see. And, I think that was, I'm always refer to it not as the best option, but as the least worst option. It just seems so extreme, this idea that you would effectively shut the country down. But ultimately, I'm very pleased that it was the right call.
New Zealand has also led on climate. I promise I won't just sing the praises of New Zealand the rest of the interview. But, in 2019, New Zealand becomes one of the first countries to make their net zero carbon target actual law. We know net zero, commitments are really important. But why is it important to make it law?
Oh, look, I just think you've got to, right? So we signed up to this Paris Agreement, all of us, every single country. And what it says is, what the agreement says is that we each need to make our own contribution, and that we kind of need to determine that based on our understanding of our own circumstances. But those things have got to add up to a global average, and that developed countries like New Zealand or the United States or others have to essentially go sooner and go further than developing countries, and for a number of reasons. One of which is we've got the resources. Two, the reason that we've got the resources is because we benefited from the high carbon economy, from the birth of the industrial era onwards. What that then says is, you got to come up with some kind of formula, right? And New Zealand, we're a very high emitter per capita, per person, and we have not yet decoupled and reduced our emissions, in the absolute volumetric sense over time. And we have had a situation where different governments have had different views on this, and things have bounced backwards and forwards. And so, essentially we said, look, we've got to create some kind of legal and institutional framework that's going to be able to maintain a level of political consensus for 3 decades until we hit net zero, and recognizing that the government will change, half a dozen times between now and 2050. We've got to have some consistency there. So we went to passing a law that said, well, we will, take on a net zero 2050 target. Conveniently, the last IPCC report on 1.5 came out pretty much the month we were actually writing the policy decisions. And so that was how the 1.5 degree threshold got written into the purpose of the Act, because that report was, pivotal in our understanding, not just of kind of emissions, but the actual outcome, like what actually happens in atmospheric warming sense. But the other thing that we did was we put a lot of effort into bringing the opposition along with us. And, there were some compromises that we had to kind of eat in order to do that. But because we had that minimum of it's got to be consistent with a 1.5 degree pathway, you can forgive a lot of the imperfections in the rest of the legislation. So I'm really pleased about that, because the government will change. It'll either change in 2023, which is our next election, or it'll change in 2026, which is the next one after that. And I think the business community needs to know that they can make investments now towards the green economy without that all getting upended again in 2 or 5 years' time.
So, I mean, as you mentioned, the 1.5 degree report comes out in fall of 2018. We have the COVID pandemic. We have changes in leadership across the world. And since the Paris Agreement, so much has changed. Like there's been so many obvious examples of the climate crisis that we've seen internationally. Yeah. I'm curious, when you look at the political landscape, how do you think it's changed since the Paris Agreement, and what does that mean for climate?
Yeah, look, it's changed hugely, which is funny because the Paris Agreement, of course, has holes that you could drive a truck through. It's not enforceable. Every country can kind of come up with its own number. There's no particular formula for how you work out your number as compared to anybody else. Everybody uses different reporting. So, it's there's a problem to it. But it really did galvanize momentum. In the developed world, in the OECD, and in particular with the Europeans, there's this kind of very aggressive push towards net zero. Because that's, I think, something that is comparable, you're either net zero or you're not. I say that with some caveats, that the kind of like the minimum safe option, right? For those of us in the kind of wealthier part of the world to say, well, okay, we'll take that on, and then we'll support developing countries, to do what they can, and with any luck that'll all sort of average out. The remarkable thing to me was that in the middle of the pandemic, last year, 2020, when everything seemed to be falling apart all over the place, a bunch of countries all signed up to that, right? So the EU, 27 member states managed to get an EU-wide net zero target over the line in law last year. The UK, which of course had been going through the throes of Brexit, but also said, yep, we're going to be net zero 2050. South Korea, Japan, all came on board with net zero targets, and China said it would hit net zero by 2060. which is massive. And so, something like 70% of the world's emissions are now in countries that are covered by a net zero target, which is terrific. That's extremely good news. And all of that managed to get over the line, even whilst those countries were dealing with COVID-19.
Yeah, and leaders from those countries, as well as countries across the world, are gathering later this year at COP26. And this really presents a big opportunity for global action on climate, but it also follows a pretty unremarkable COP25 in 2019. In fact, a lot of people deemed COP25 a failure, and you were there. What do you think went wrong with COP25?
Well, I think you could put it down to a lot of things, but essentially, on a few key things, there are a group of countries that are dragging the chain, because of their own, what they perceive as their own national interest, or national economic interest, and they somehow think that that's not going to be affected by the impacts of climate change. That they just dragged out, negotiations until the clock stopped. And at the same time, there were a group of countries, and New Zealand was one of them, who said, look, we want an agreement, but not at any cost, right? Like we're prepared to compromise up to a line, and the line that was being proposed wasn't acceptable. So I personally fell into that camp of people that said no agreement is better than a poor agreement. And I still fall into that, because I think on the, when you think about, the outstanding issues, and it's things like, how do we cooperate internationally using carbon markets and things like that, you can still have legitimate Paris recognized relationships between two countries or groups of countries under the existing system. And you see, with, like, for example, the agreement between Switzerland and Peru recently, they're kind of cracking on with it. It doesn't actually stop us from doing some of those things. And actually, I think the attention needs to be on people's domestic economies. Like, what are you actually doing to bring your emissions down? And how do we work together on those things? So, while it was disappointing, I don't think it was catastrophic. And I think that we've just got to, work with each other, and align our trade agreements, that kind of stuff to, actually get some action going.
You mentioned setting up that mechanism for a global carbon market was one of the failures of COP25. So what would a global carbon market actually do?
Well, who knows? And I think that's part of the problem. There used to be a global carbon market under the Kyoto Protocol, and there were massive problems with it. So you had the hot air scandal with millions and millions flowing around the world that did not represent any actual sequestration or reduction in emissions anywhere in the world, that collapsed the price of carbon. And New Zealand was pretty badly affected by those, right? So the price of carbon here collapsed to something like $2 or $2.50 a ton during that period of time, for a number of reasons. But the flaws with that global system were kind of the primary reason. And it didn't recover until the then Conservative government that we had actually shut the border to those and said, look, we're just going to opt out of the system at this point. And the price rose up to about $15 a ton, within a month. And it's at $50 a ton. So, I think if it works, a global carbon market will, reduce emissions globally, which we've got to do at the lowest cost, right? That's kind of the idea. But I think our experience with what happened under Kyoto means we want to build that with extreme caution so as not to repeat the mistakes of that period.
So how do you think global leaders should act to implement one of those global carbon markets this year?
Well, I think a really solid rule set is really important. So you've got to ensure that, I mean, the most important principle is environmental integrity. It's this idea that, if I'm buying a ton of carbon offsets from somewhere, that actually that represents a real emission somewhere in the world, and that's verifiably true. That's the most important thing. Second of all, you can't count it twice, right? So the country that's sells it can't also count it towards its NDC if the country buying it's counting it towards their NDC. That you've got to have total transparency right up and down the chain around these things. And you can't carry over any of the dodgy stuff that happened in the previous system into the new system. And I think that's really one of the main sticking points, because there's a bunch of countries that want to be able to use the surplus that they built up, even if it doesn't actually represent anything, and they want to stick that in, take that out of the Kyoto period and carry it forward into the Paris period. And to me, that's just unacceptable.
Well, you mentioned that New Zealand has a carbon market and price on carbon. How has a price on carbon worked for New Zealand?
Well, to tell you the truth, it is only just starting to bite now, and we've had it since 2008, but of course 2008 coincided with the GFC, and also the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, and the timing of the earthquakes and the GFC, or the country's sort of recovery from the GFC, and we had a conservative government that was pretty skeptical about climate change. They kind of gutted the scheme. They didn't get rid of it, which is good, but they just kind of changed the settings and effectively neutered it for the better part of a decade. So that when we came in 2017, the price of carbon was about $17 a tonne. To their credit, that previous government had done quite a significant review, and there were about 4 or 5 really big reforms that had been proposed, and we simply carried those forward. We beefed them up a little. We added some stuff around agriculture and so on, but we basically carried that work program forward. And I think that sent a message to the market, to the kind of private sector, that there was going to be a consistency of government action on this, and that therefore they kind of needed to start getting their act together. The reforms that we then implemented in our last term, like I said, meant that the price is now kicking at $50 a tonne and is sure to rise in the not too distant future. And that is now at a price point that businesses are feeling it sufficiently that they are starting to kind of go, okay, well, rather than just buy cheap offsets and continue as normal, what do we need to do to actually decarbonize our business, because those units are getting pretty expensive.
Well, how do you value carbon markets compared to mandates to reduce emissions?
Describe to me what you mean by a mandate.
Laws, regulations, limits.
Yeah, look, the two actually have to go hand in hand. So we would say, like, I'll give you an example. We brought in what we call a fee-based scheme for vehicles recently. And the idea is that the less efficient your vehicle is, the higher the price. It's essentially a fee. But the more efficient the vehicle, it gets a rebate, and the rebate is paid for by the fees, right? So the people who are insisting on driving around in inefficient Ford Rangers pay the highest fee, and then that gets plowed back into people who buy the most efficient vehicle, which of course is an electric vehicle. And in terms of the adoption of low emission and zero emission vehicles, if you wanted the emissions trading scheme price to achieve the same outcome, it would have to be something like $500 a tonne. So, it's not $500 a tonne. And if it was $500 a tonne, we would have massive problems in other parts of the economy. So, by bringing that policy in, we're achieving, an outcome that it would require the ETS price to be really high. And so you kind of need those two things to sort of work hand in glove, because you also want to use a price to get change happening right across the economy, as fast as you can, and you can't mandate and regulate everything. And if you do, often you're imposing additional cost that a simple pricing incentive will achieve by itself.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. One of the COP26 finance goals is to unleash trillions of dollars of private investment into a net zero economy. So what can governments do to encourage such investments?
Look, there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, having a net zero target in law is a pretty good indicator to the private sector about which investments are worthwhile and which are not. Associated with that, we've also introduced a law here. It hasn't actually been passed yet, but it's on the way, to require listed companies and financial institutions to report on their climate-related risks. This is off the back of Michael Bloomberg's and Mark Carney's task force on climate-related financial disclosures, and we've essentially taken that and said, well, we're going to apply that in law here to companies that list on our stock exchange and companies over a certain threshold in the financial markets. And then what that does is it gives information to management, directors, and shareholders that they might not otherwise have about, what's a risky investment versus what's a less risky investment. And lo and behold, high carbon pathways are higher risk. And we know that they're higher risk because the government has a legislative agenda going in the opposite direction. And you can see the price of carbon starting to impact things and so on. So, that will significantly shift investment flows in our economy. And I know that there are other countries, including the US, that are considering similar regimes as well. And so I think, that measure really helps. And finally, some countries, including New Zealand and a number of US cities and states, have set up green banks. And these are essentially direct investment houses that operate on a commercial basis. They might be state sponsored, but they have a commercial kind of mandate to invest directly in decarbonisation projects and companies. And as they do so, they can crowd in private finance, to come alongside it. And that again helps to sort of move the investment flows towards the green economy and away from the dirty economy.
Well, how should we scale these climate risk disclosures to the global community in a way that really ensures financial transparency in a global market around climate?
Look, I think there's a number of ways to do that. I know that I think that Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg did a terrific job of getting that out to central banks around the world. So I think there's something like 65 central banks around the world that are quite seriously looking at climate-related risk, because it represents a risk to the financial system of their country, which of course is, the whole point of a central bank is to manage. And so there is pressure building from that side of things on the political institutions to say, actually, hey, we need mandatory reporting around some of this stuff, because, whilst you could argue that, there's already a fiduciary duty to disclose material risks, and clearly climate change is a material risk, companies actually aren't doing it. And they're not doing it because they don't know how, and because there's no established standards, and they're kind of worried that if they did and their competition doesn't, that they'll get punished for it, and yada yada yada. So having mandatory regimes, reporting regimes, I think makes life simpler and easier for everybody.
Do you think this will be a topic at COP26?
I know, I know it will be. Yeah. I was at a meeting of finance ministers at the last COP, at COP25, and it, it was kind of all around this sort of stuff. So there was a bunch of finance ministers who had come to COP. So normally the only ministers who go to COPs are climate change ministers like me. But at the time, I was also an associate finance minister, and so I managed to kind of wrangle being in this meeting. But it was a good thing to see finance ministers showing up, because ultimately they have more control over the levers of any given government than the Minister for Climate Change will ever have.
Well, what do you expect from this COP26 to be some of the most contentious climate finance points during these negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, so climate finance, I think is a slightly confused term because, we absolutely do need to unlock private investment and get it flowing in the right direction. But when we talk about climate finance in the context of the COP process, what we're essentially talking about is assistance from the developed world to the developing world to both help them to adapt to the effects of climate change, and also to help, modernize their economies and reduce their emissions. And I have to say that the developed world has singularly failed to deliver on the promise that it made in Paris, which was to unlock $100 billion a year, US, of climate finance from, the developed world to the developing world. And that was central to the deal. It was critical. And so there's not a lot of trust in the international community. And that's really at the source of a lot of it. And I think until, those of us in the wealthier countries actually deliver on that, it's going to be really hard to make progress in a whole bunch of other areas, whether it's kind of transparency or, deadlines or, carbon markets or anything like that. Because, with some kind of reasonable view of things, the developing world is kind of saying, well, hang on, how can we trust you to actually deliver on, this bit if you haven't done what you said you would do first?
Exactly. I don't think there's currently any kind of mechanism in the Paris Agreement for funding loss and damages experienced by those vulnerable countries that you were talking about. So how would you like to see world leaders act during COP26 to ensure the right financial mechanism is in place to actually help those extremely vulnerable nations?
Yeah, well, loss and damage is another category of finance again. And there wasn't actually agreement on that in Paris, and there hasn't been agreement around it since. So you've got finance towards adaptation. How do you kind of get ahead of some of the impending disasters? You've got finance around mitigation. How do you help countries to reduce their emissions, modernize their economy and reduce their emissions? The piece around loss and damage is essentially the notion that the countries that have been the primary causes of climate change would compensate those countries that are feeling the impacts of climate change first and worst and soonest. And so it's a sort of more of almost a retrospective kind of measure rather than with adaptation finance, which is more prospective. And there's an argument to be made there. Well, there is an argument being made around that, and it is highly contentious. And so the view that I take with that is I don't think that will unlock at this COP. I think it would help if the wealthier countries took a more kind of sympathetic view towards it. But that I kind of think about, well, what are the things that I can influence? And that really comes down to what is the support that New Zealand provides. And generally what we do is we act primarily in the Pacific, and we do so, bilaterally and plurilaterally with the Pacific Islands, who are amongst the countries that have had the least impact on climate change, but also are feeling the effects the most severely, and have the least capacity to be able to deal with it, because they're not wealthy countries. A number of them are extremely low lying when it comes to sea level rise. They're all very vulnerable to cyclones and so on. So, I kind of think, well, what can we do with our closest neighbors, with whom we share the Pacific Ocean, and where there's a lot of contact and flow of peoples backwards and forwards between our islands and theirs. Could that be, if we can even come close to getting that right, a useful model for others to follow as we try and, patch up the multilateral agreement around this kind of thing.
There was so much the international community had to do to coordinate on COVID, right? And there were successes and failures. How do you think the global coordination and response on COVID will impact how nations work together on issues like the climate crisis going forward?
Yeah, well, I think we've already seen some of that with, Britain saying this is going to be an in-person COP, let's get everyone vaccinated and get them there. And they're doing that because they've got the sense of urgency around climate change, but also, the vaccine rollout is largely a developed world thing, right? Most developing countries are still struggling to get their hands on vaccines, don't have a lot of support for the rollout, and so on. And so the kind of stark inequalities between countries are showing up there. And it's having an impact on those countries' ability to participate in COP. And so, and assisting with the vaccine rollout is one of the things that countries like ours can do actually to directly ensure that COP is successful. Because a country, sort of a COP that's just a bunch of, rich countries is not going to be successful.
Well, yeah. What do you think? When it comes down to it, what do you think could keep COP26 from being a success?
Well, there's so much uncertainty still around COVID that could really put a spanner in the works. I've got about 5 contingency plans just for my own participation, because I've, at the moment, under current settings with what we currently know, I'll have to spend 2 weeks in managed isolation on the way back into the country, which is a month, so it's 36 hours to get from where I am to Glasgow. There's, something like 7 to 10 days on the ground. There's 36 hours back, and then there's 2 weeks of managed isolation. That's quite difficult for a minister to take an entire month out of 12 months, to participate in a conference, especially when we've got such a heavy domestic agenda. Now, it's important that we're there, but things like that could really spike it, and we come from one of the luckier countries, right? So you can imagine what it's like for, smaller, less well-off countries, and how do they manage their participation?
So, in addition to your role in government leading on climate, you are also helping to drive the international conversation on climate change with one of our favorite podcasts, What Comes After, What Comes Next. I'm curious, because you're in this every single day, what have you gained through the conversations that you're having on the show?
Oh, yeah, look, What Comes After, What Comes Next started as a lockdown project. And the thing is that lockdown ended up not lasting as long as we thought it was going to, and it's sort of taken on a bit of a life of its own. And I'm glad you love it. Thank you. All of the guests that I've had so far have been not New Zealanders, and it is because what I wanted to do was to try and bring the outside view into our domestic conversations, right? Because like any country, it's parochial. People kind of go, oh, that'll never work. No one else in the world is doing that. To which my response is, well, actually, there's quite a lot going on in the rest of the world, and we're not quite as hot as we think we are. So that's really been the primary thing, and the variety of guests who have participated in this. It's climate scientists and economists and artists and authors and journalists. You name it, and in many ways, it's the consistency across all of their experiences and all of their kind of professional backgrounds, I think, that has kind of given that show what it's got.
Yeah, this is the last question here as we wrap up. New Zealand has had relatively strong consensus on climate across parties. You mentioned earlier the real party differences that you do have, but you've done a great job on your show discussing U.S. politics. And it's very clear you're in a very different situation than the United States political landscape. With that Zero Carbon Act we were talking about, it passed unopposed, right? No one voted against it in the final vote. Are the policy successes of New Zealand actually replicable in other nations?
Yes, they are. But I don't think that they're replicable in every other nation. And you're right, the political environment and the constitutional arrangements that we have here are so different from what they are in the United States that I couldn't expect that, you'd be able to replicate that there. But there might be ways in which you can kind of back into it, if you like. So, obviously the US is kind of the home of free markets and so on. And there is, a reasonable kind of dialogue in the kind of Republican side around the idea of, cap and trade schemes. And, if you can kind of change the facts on the ground by implementing these kinds of things, then, I think at some point you kind of talk yourselves into a version of a political consensus without necessarily the kind of institutional arrangements that we have. And so, the US has actually been remarkably successful at reducing its emissions in line with its targets up to this point, not because of what was going on at the federal level, but because of what's been going on at the city and state level. And some of your biggest states, California, New York, and so on, have been very aggressive on this, particularly California. And, you kind of get California, that's sort of quite a large portion of the whole, right? So, whereas New Zealand has a population roughly the size of Los Angeles City. So it's a bit easier to get consensus here. So I think that, it's about kind of building on those things and especially this piece around getting the investment flows moving, because if you do that, and frankly, within the US context, if people are making money out of it, then a future Republican administration might not be hot on climate change, but they might at least shy away from tipping over the system too much, because that would destroy too many vested interests that they would rather not. So that's a kind of hopeful view, and I guess we'll see how it goes. John Kerry and I had a call a few months ago, not long after he'd been appointed as the climate envoy, and it was one of the first questions I asked. I'm like, I love what your administration's doing. It's great to have you back. What happens in 4 years' time, or eight years' time? His view was very much, well, by the time we get to that point, so much will have changed in the economy, that the momentum will be taken care of itself. And I'm kind of crossing my fingers and taking his word for it.
That is a tidbit of optimism that I will cling to too. You've been, Minister Shaw, you've been so generous with your time. Again, the podcast, What Comes After, What Comes Next, we will link to it. And if you're listening to this show, you got to check it out. The Honorable James Shaw, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. My pleasure.